Okay, so this is question 16 from the progress review. Let's look at the scenario. So we have an organization called Blake Co. Here's some background information. I mean, you can pick this up from the question itself straight away. They assemble specialist motor vehicles. They own 4 assembly plants. They have goods that are delivered to the plant, and the factory workers work a standard 8-hour day. Right? And what they do is they tend to overrun on overtime or hours because they have to fulfill a certain book order. Yes. The staff do 1 shift a day, and the work is very specialist in nature. Some other things, the shift workers arrive at 7 a.m. They clock in using these electronic IDs, and each production worker has a unique ID number. So really, you can see we're focusing. This question is really on focusing on the wages system, right? So typically, what happens is that each production worker has a unique ID number. Worker is logged on as being at work. Shift workers are paid from the time of logging in. So I'm just, a lot of these things you can almost pick the issues out as you're going along. So the question tells you straight away that logging in is not monitored. Some other things, they need to produce 400 cars, and even if it requires overtime, something else, overtime is not monitored. So it's right there for you to pick out straight away. No tricks. Shift foreman does monitor breaks, though. This question could have been interesting. They could have turned this question on its head and asked you what were the controls they had in place that worked, right? Anyway, wage hours are transmitted electronically to the payroll department. Standing data does exist for these personnel. And what happens is that the payroll staff compare the logged in hours, right, and to the computerized standing data. But then they have this code they use to confirm the accuracy of the transfer. And that code, as well as what's used to authorize the payment of net wages. This code is known around the business. Issue there. List of net pay then sent over internal network to accounts department. It could be secure, but it's internal. Something else. Then you have, in terms of the payment of the wages, you have a clerk. So whenever you see the word clerk in any accounting exam, be suspicious, because straight away they're trying to highlight to you this person doesn't have enough authority to do this. So straight away, don't sort of take this with some kind of equity sort of approach. No, take it as a kind of failure of hierarchy, right? So there we are. The clerk also ensures and authorizes and makes the payment. So those are 2 different parts there, issues there. And every few weeks, yes, issue again, financial accountant reviews the amount of wages. And then in terms of leaving, they send an email to the payroll department, and the receipt of the email is not monitored by the personnel department. So a number of issues. I don't think I even, in my own answer, because that's how I've done this, I don't even touch on all of them because it's impossible. I'm trying to do it within the time, so I'm picking the ones I thought were interesting. So this is the question. Let's start. List 4 control objectives of a payroll system. So I've said here, in terms of control objectives, you're always thinking of this expression to ensure, right? To ensure. So what you're thinking is, what is the purpose of any system? It actually doesn't. I think almost conceptually, it's actually a conceptual idea that I think, if you wish to go there, borders on elements of civilization. Good civilized societies have systems in place. Call the system whatever you wish, a healthcare system, a justice system. If you don't have systems, you will have chaos. So always think of a situation before a system was put into place. So it is likely there would have been chaos and a series of issues and errors. So I think it's important when you think of payroll, you should think, I've written here, there's a parallel to our traditional payable system, because really what we have here is a scenario where we've been provided with some service and we have to pay for it. It's a labor, so we have a labor resource that's turned up, done some work for us, and we have to remunerate. So to a certain extent, there is a number of issues here in terms of this system. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure, like any time when you're trying to pay someone for something, that we're not paying more than we should, that we're not being, I think that's really the issue here, in terms of the system, that we're not letting go more of our resources than should be going. So we want to find a way to ensure that we capture, just like you would with payables, that you only have the right certified suppliers on your standing data, they're monitored, and then that sort of thing. So I've written a few ideas here as they come to mind, to ensure the standing data of all service providers are accurately recorded. So all your employees, and that standing data can only be altered by authorized personnel. Like I said, what you're always trying to do is think, if there was no system, then what would be the case? To ensure that only personnel who offer us services have the potential to be paid, to ensure that personnel no longer offering our services are are no longer paid. So you don't want a scenario where you still have you're still paying people, to ensure the accurate recording of these hours of services. So only what it is, just like you would, only goods received for are paid, right? Like a payable. To ensure that only hours worked are performed are recorded, and to ensure that additional hours worked that vary from the standing data are accurately recorded. I'm even going to put here investigated and um, um, and paid. There's also the element of goodwill. We want to make sure we pay our workers. So if we don't record the data efficiently, how do we pay them the right amount to ensure that the right amount is paid? Just like we don't want to lose workers. People can leave our organization if they feel that we haven't paid them correctly. Then paying it, I mean, they only ask for four. The agreed rate, I've gone here to talk about, to ensure this system also ensures that we make the correct deductions to HMRC, right, to avoid any fines, penalties, and also to ensure the accurate statutory benefits are made, to avoid any fines or penalties. So that was the first part to that question. Then the question then went on to ask us, it says that recommend a control to over, sorry, here, in respect of the wages recording and payment system, explain 5 deficiencies and recommend a control and describe a test. So really, here, they want 3 headings, which you will put together. You are literally going in to pluck out the deficiency. I, in my own, because of the way I'm writing, I don't do it so well where I end every 10 deficiency literally stating what the consequence is. I repeat, you must state what the consequence is. I mean, I do that, but you could do it better. So literally saying this will lead to, this will lead to, if you can. I mean, I find it slightly prescriptive, but I think it's safer to do it that way because you then satisfy the requirements of the examiner. Right. Um, so the logging in is not monitored. I thought this was an issue. There's so many issues. Potential for colleagues logging in for each other, and therefore I've written in, therefore the organization paying employees for hours does not work. So that means they're losing money, and in a way this could lead to fraud. So that's where I went. And then in terms of control recommendation, I suggested installing CCTV camera in the area when employees, and then I written here, observe the card and see if it's regularly watched, serviced, and reviewed, for any exceptions. So maybe there's a, if you like, in terms of cars that have been, if you observe somebody putting in 2 cards for their colleague, if you like, I think is an issue. I felt overtime is not monitored, so that was I thought that was staring us. And as overtime is typically paid at a higher rate, and it is general knowledge that you need to get these 400 cars, there's a chance that people will try and inflate their overtime hours, right? So the organization could end up paying more money than have actually been worked. So I've written here, either establish a system of a standard overtime hours, agreed overtime hours that require authorization on completion, or maybe a second system of logging in a second time for your overtime. So at the end of your normal shift, you end and then you do that. And then it really is about observing your recommendation. Review a sample of overtime hours and agree that they've been authorized by the foreman, because this is the problem. Or review the system of assigning and recording these overtime hours, and any deviations need to be investigated, and review any exception reports. So um, yes, I've written here, given the degree of overtime, that are not standard in nature. No mention of monitoring, reviewing of payroll hour deviations, or transmission of standing data. In fact, something else that this is business about this, the code, the transfer of data is not reviewed for errors. It's just the data comes, this clerk puts the code in to confirm. So that's another issue actually that could go in there, that transmission of data. So all payroll hours should be authorized and reviewed for any deviations before validating payroll figures. And then it's about reviewing the authorizations, because we're observing the control, the authorizations and the signatures that this has been done, reviewing exception reports, giving the high level of overtime hours currently worked. That word, that code, the cat, is poor. So I've written the consequences here are that there's a lack of security. Anyone will be able to interfere with the data, leading to fraud or loss of sensitive data. So I've argued that you need different instruments to be used for authorization, and it should be changed regularly and only known by the relevant personnel. And observe if this has been done, and that the transmission of data is mapped and net wages are paid. Observe. It's really about observing the authorization process here. Then, of course, here, this idea of the clerk having the bank details of employees. I just mixed a lot of things together, every few weeks. So there's no segregation of duty. The clerk is not senior enough to authorize and make payments. This is definitely one that should go in. The clerk. Talk about the clerk. So the clerk should just not be authorizing it. It's a standard one to always write. The financial director should be doing the authorizing and signing, and this should be done before every payment, right? So what you're then doing here is that you're reviewing this implemented system of authorizations and reviewing exception reports. Okay, good. Then the next question was to do with the next question was to do with substantive procedures, right? So again, like I said, think about this from the point of view of, well, there's a number of issues here. What assertions are you interested in? It is a liability. It's a liability. So on the one hand, there's the potential for understatement, because liabilities are typically it's understatement. That's the first point here. So, but there is also the issue, which technically leads us naturally into the issue of completeness. Right. Then there's the other issue, of course, of fraud or occurrence. Did this actually occur? And then there's the question of how accurate are these figures? And in terms of, are we paying people that we shouldn't pay in terms of rights and obligations? So I think the assertions should drive your argument here. So that's how I'm going to go with these assertions. I'm going to talk about completeness, occurrence, accuracy. The other thing I thought was interesting that you will get marks for is there's a number of components to payroll. There's gross wages, there's net wages, there's payroll liabilities. So all of those need to be accurate. So, you can focus on those. Um, the good thing about payroll all the time is this question of analysis. You are looking, I've written glaring, sometimes you see the word significant. That's fine. Significant differences. So you can compare payroll from one year to the next as a whole. You can look at payroll across different parts of the organization. Um, you can look at overtime, total overtime payments from one year to the next. Um, and if you can, and that's what pushes you to investigate further, right? So that's the first thing, and that this would have been done as part of your risk assessment. Now, a standard test for all expenses, generally, I've talked about it before, is what we call a proof in total, right? A proof in total says take the normal figure, the prior year figure, build in the expectations, inflation or whatever number of people who have joined, and find out, process that, and now compare that with the actual event, and then assess the variance. So maybe 10,000 last year, multiply that by, maybe you say, oh, there's another person coming on, and maybe that means that will be another £1,000, and multiply that 11 if you're paying people one. I'm just making this up. This is the extra person's wage, maybe inflation, get your answer, right? I'm just going to make that up at 12,500. Imagine the real answer was 12,560. You're like, yeah, £60 is not material. That's fair. That's something you should do as well. Remember that when we look for completeness, we are looking external to the organization. So we're saying, when I say external, we're saying that everything, we want to make sure that all the data is on the system. So I'm looking at external invoices, hours worked, just like payroll, just like goods received, not invoiced. Similar principle. All those invoices we've received, all the hours worked, all the personnel contracts, we want to make sure those have been posted before the year end for completeness. Right. Now, that's completeness. Now for existence, so remember I was looking outside to confirm to the financial statements, right? Going outside, looking at outside documents to confirm to the financial statements. That's completeness. For existence, I'm actually looking at the wages ledger or the financial statements and tracing that back to the original timesheets to actually be sure that this thing occurred. I should really say occurred, really occurred, and that the client does exist. But occurrence, that's what I'm doing. So I'm going back to the original timesheets from the data on the financial statements. So I access wages list or wages payable list and walk backwards to the original timesheets. Accuracy, there's a number of things you could do for accuracy. You just want to almost repeat what the system is doing. So you just take a sample. I've said from each month because that's the point with accuracy. It's not just about randomly picking. You are literally wanting to be testing for regular accuracy, that accuracy is consistent. So you're saying sample wages from each month. So you pick some sample, from maybe, I don't know, whatever, 3 or 4 from each month, write that list out and literally recalculate the hours worked, statutory deductions, income tax deductions for accuracy. Again, to a certain extent, for existence or occurrence, which I kind of repeat myself here, you can reconcile the contract. You can look at contracts which are external and get marry that again to the payroll figures again to test for completeness. Right, and so that's what I've done. I mean, again, please, I think look at the mark scheme and try and, when you're writing these, try and aim. I think the assertions help you a lot. Again, you're thinking completeness, you're thinking existence or occurrence, if you like. Then you're thinking accuracy. Um, yeah, I think those are the key ones. Right. In terms of the impact here, you might remember, but this is good revision, that we have most likely for service organizations what's referred to as type 1 and type 2 reports. Now, this is about grading. You have to go through the structure. You don't do this work, so you don't have any evidence. So you need to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence, right? Sufficient and appropriate evidence. What we don't want is a scenario, if you remember from our report, our modification, where we can modify for 2 reasons: material misstatement and lack of sufficient evidence, that we can also call, or I like to call, limitation of scope. So you don't want a scenario where you just can't gain access to payroll controls and then you're having to decide, am I going to give material not pervasive, so qualified, or pervasive, adverse, disclaimer of opinion. So you're trying to avoid being along this road, which is why you try and push for this report. Now, I've written that it is rare. I actually think it's impossible, but it doesn't matter. I suppose you just want to note the idea. You can say, listen, it is rare but possible for the provider to allow auditors to access to access and assess. I should have put that their controls. Rare, pretty rare. Um, so what is most likely is that you will get a report from the auditors of the service organization, providing a simple description of the design of the controls at the service organization. So again, it's good to just look at this. It just provides a report. It provides a report on the opinion of the description, just a description of the systems and the suitability of the controls, as opposed to a type 2 report, which will do a lot more description, design, operating effectiveness, and it's quite in depth. Suitability of controls, effectiveness, description of the tests of controls performed by the auditor. So this is your perfect report, type 2. Yes, it's more expensive, but yes, please. And if you intend to use this report, again, you won't have time to write all of this. I'm just stating it so you know. The type 1 or type 2 report, I suspect, is enough to just highlight, is to assess the competence and the independence of the auditor. So what you're trying to do ultimately is, because this is to do with wages and not stock, that is the case. It's probably a payroll department or a payroll company somewhere. And that really is where I think the best you can do. I don't think visiting the organization, I mean, I'm just writing it because I'm writing. Visiting the service organization, contacting the service organization, they might let you come along. But what you want to end this picture with all the time is, listen, if this isn't possible, we might need to modify the opinion, due to the inability to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence, and most likely it'll be a qualified opinion due to the isolated nature of the event. I mean, wages are material, so by virtue of them being material, and you can just push for them to be material. You see, materiality is subjective. You are the auditor. There is no rule that says this is not material. You can say, I mean, it doesn't make sense that wages should be material, especially the controls. If you're not comfortable with controls, you don't have enough evidence to give an opinion. Right? Yes, and that is question 16.